Now that I have my armature completely covered with paper mache, I am ready to move on to the wood clay. So for this, we're going to need some gloves, and I do have a selection of gloves, both in size and in material. And we're going to need, of course, to cover our work area with newspaper. And of course, we're going to need our sculpture, our Alebrijes, and of course the wood clay. So the wood clay will be found at your table in a Ziploc bag. I'll show it to you here as soon as I get my other glove on. And as I mentioned before, the wood clay is just a mixture of sawdust and wood glue and a couple of other materials to help bind it together. It is not going to be like your normal clay that you're used to working with, in that the earthenware clay was more malleable. This is just, of course, slightly hydrated sawdust with binding agents. So it will not roll into a coil. It will not handle the pressure of rolling it into a ball with your fingers and your hands. So it's mainly going to be a pressing motion when we work with this. Now, since it is glue, I don't want to leave this sitting out exposed a lot. So as I pull out a piece, I'm going to just fold the bag over, keep the rest of it moist. And I'm going to work with about a size that when I flatten it out, it's going to be close to maybe like a 50-cent piece. Not too thick. I don't want to work with too big of a piece at once. And I do start flattening it out first with my hands. And then I'm going to select a spot, place it on top, and I'm going to use my fingers to thin it out a little bit and press it on to my paper mache. So this will take a little bit of patience. I don't use both fingers or hands at the same time pressing like this. I don't go back and forth like this. What I do is I use one hand to kind of support the wood clay, as the other hand, and really just one digit of it, works to press it down onto the newspaper and to spread it out some and thin out that clay. I don't need a really big, thick layer of wood clay on my sculpture. I just want to cover it. I also don't want to see newspaper showing through it. So as you're doing this, if you start to see newspaper, then you're pressing it too thin, and you'll want to not thin it out and press it down as hard. So this is why you needed the 2 layers at the least of paper mache, because of this pressing motion. If you only have 1 layer, it's going to be a little bit too weak to withstand this pressing and thinning out of the wood clay. And if it does stick to your glove a little bit, just try to carefully peel it off as best you can and continue on. Sometimes what I find is if I don't use that finger for a little bit, that will kind of dry a little bit and make it easier to then work with. Once I have one piece applied, then I come back to my source of material. I pull out another chunk about similar in size. Now, of course, if I'm going to work in a smaller area like the ears or down into the legs, I'll probably work with a little bit smaller chunks of clay. And again, I'm going to first flatten this out some with my hand. And once I have it flattened out some, I'm going to apply it, and I'm going to overlap it a little bit. So I overlap it with the stuff I already applied. I'm going to press it onto that older stuff, or the stuff put on previously. And if I have little chunks like that that fall off, I'm going to just pick them up, press them on. And again, I'm going to use one hand to help press the wood clay down onto the body, and I'm using just the other one to kind of help support. So notice it is on the wood clay. It's near the fingers that are doing the pressing and thinning of the wood clay, and that's just to help give it support while I'm doing this. And I'm just going to keep on applying this in a similar fashion until this is completely covered. I do check to where I had that overlap. I want to try to minimize any type of line from the overlapping. And I want to try to get it as smooth as possible in my finished look. So I try not to have any cracks or wrinkles showing on the main part there. On the edges, it's going to be a little bit thinner. It's going to have a little bit of a roughness to it, but that's okay. I'm going to eventually cover that with more wood clay. So when I press and work with this, I'm paying attention to my main section, my main body of it, to try to get it to look as smooth as possible and as even as possible while I'm pressing. So that will be the process in applying the wood clay to our project. Notice I'm working on one side of it. I haven't gone underneath. And I want to give this time to sit up and glue to the newspaper before I do move on to the underneath section. And it will dry fairly quickly. So let me grab one I started this morning here. And this one I started during first period class. And so it's been maybe about an hour since I last touched it. And already I can touch it. It's not sticky anymore. Is it completely dry? No, but it is starting to crust over and harden. So that's why we thin it out, because then it doesn't take as long for the material to dry. So I'm going to continue to cover this one with just a thin layer of the wood clay. Okay, so I have completely wrapped my Alebrijes in wood clay. He is currently drying. You saw there near the end that after I applied all the wood clay to the bottom of the feet, I took a piece of foil. You can also use plastic. In fact, there is plastic over there at the window where we're keeping our projects for storage. And I pressed, stood my Alebrijes up. I pressed the feet down so that I can start to create a flat edge of where the weight will rest onto the feet. And then I picked it up and I lightly tapped to move that area out again because a little bit of the wood clay did stick. And that will help me make sure I have a nice flat bottom in which this can stand. So this needs to finish drying. You can see that it has dried enough that I can touch it and I'm not getting any of the wood clay off onto my fingers, but it's still very soft in places where I had just applied the wood clay today. In our next video, we are going to look at using the wood clay to add some small details and features that we could not make during the armature stage. So in my sketch, I had some spike forms going up back some. I was going to use the characteristic that the real Alebrijes sculptures have of the larger eyes. So I'll be adding those. And I'm going to experiment also with possibly making wings separately and seeing if something that large could attach to this after the main body has dried. Earlier, some of you have asked about wings. So on one of my armatures, I did create the wings. I haven't covered this yet in the wood clay, but it is paper mache. So we know that during the building stages from pipe cleaner to foil to and through the paper mache, it is possible to add something as large as wings to the body. So let's see if something larger can attach as well as something smaller. In my original example, I had added the toes, the mohawk to my birdfish creature here after the main body had dried. So it is possible to add smaller details and features to our Alebrijes sculptures with the wood clay. So I'm curious to see if something larger will attach. So that will be next video, adding some details and features before we go on to the last stages of painting and adding patterns.